The church sat like a thing remembered wrong. Its white paint had peeled into maps of brown. The steeple leaned at an angle that made the gulls fly in slow circles. I parked under the live oaks and felt the heat press through the patrol car's thin insulation, the damp that lives in Palmetto County even when the sun is out. From where I stood on Sawgrass Road, the cemetery looked like a throat of light between oaks, and the church doors were shut tight. On the altar, through the tall stained glass window, I could see 13 candles arranged in a strict rectangle, all of them lit despite the padlock and the lack of footprints in the mud. If you want to hear the whole thing, stay with me to the end. Subscribe and leave a like to support the channel. It helps us keep telling stories that matter. I had been down to a lot of strange calls in Palmetto, and strange has its own weight. The pleading voice down a cell, a neighbor who swears he saw 3 men take a boy into the pines, someone found wandering the county line, babbling about the tide. This was catalogued as odd before I even opened my notebook. Sheriff Morrison met me at the gate with his hands shoved in a coat he wasn't wearing. He likes to carry his authority like a second skin when the town is nervous. He handed me a slim folder, Protocol, in Morrison's block handwriting across the cover, and did not smile. "People are lighting candles and coming up out of the marsh," he said. "Teresa Alvarez tried to get inside first thing this morning. Neighbors called us." There are things you learn fast in small counties. 1. The sheriff's hands tell you more than his mouth. 2. The protocol folder is treated like a relic. 3. Grief will drive otherwise sensible people past fences and good sense. Teresa Alvarez had been an easy name to remember. Her brother, Pastor Alvarez, had died 2 winters back. His funeral burned the church's capacity twice over. When grief sits in a town, it sets habits. When grief meets something no one can explain, the habits harden into rules. The folder I'm carrying now has a composition of the town's formal and informal reactions. It isn't law, it's less than that, and more dangerous. A series of agreements stitched together by a century of whispering. I read rules aloud sometimes in my head when I drive across the county, like a prayer of caution. They are practical, almost bureaucratic, and then they tremble at the edges into superstition. Never cross the marsh line after dusk. Do not alter the altar's candles. Do not shout names aloud toward the cattails. If someone calls your name nearby and you can't see them, radio for backup and do not respond vocally. If compelled walking occurs, contain, not engage. Most of these are born from 3 decades of trying to explain what happens when the marsh answers a voice. The first 2 call-outs had been simple enough. A woman on Clouston Road reported that her porch light had gone out and the radio in her kitchen began playing an old hymn she hadn't heard in years. No station, no source, just a hymn in the room. Another call came from a couple who swore a child's voice recited a number over and over outside their window, 47. Those first reports were left as exactly what they were, reports. Then the candles started appearing. 13 is a stubborn number in this place. The 13 white candles turned up in houses, on porches, in the window wells of the elementary school, always grouped in the same arrangement. They did not scorch the wood where they rested. They left an oily residue and a smell like old wax and rain. The same people who brought casseroles to funerals brought the candles inside and set them without asking anyone. For the town, the candles became both offering and warning. For me, a practical man who left Miami with a battered duffel and a law enforcement certificate, the candles were evidence and then a test. When I walked into the church, the air had that acoustical softness you only get in places built for prayer, walls that accept your voice and keep it. The altar was a small island of light between the stained glass and pews. The candles were arranged in their unsteady geometry, and the wax pooled beneath like scales. The hymn hummed without a mouth, a layered thing that came and went from the rafters and from the ground at once. It was not loud, it overwhelmed because it was intimate. There were no footprints leading up to the doors that morning, but the candles had been lit, and someone had taken time, deliberate hands, to arrange them. "Any sign of forced entry?" I asked, the way you ask about footprints when you do not want to accept the answer you already suspect. "No," Morrison said, "locked from the inside, every time we've checked. No heat signature in the back rooms." Teresa had been at the gate when I turned back out. She had the kind of flat, blunt face that makes her earnest grief read as a steady tool. She stood with her hands in her coat pockets like someone was trying to hold a shaken animal close to the chest. "I wanted to go in," she told us. "Pastor would have wanted." Morrison cut her off with a look that had sympathy folded in. "We have rules," he said. "You know the rules, Teresa." The rules live in different dialects in different people. To Morrison, they are mitigation. To families, they are a ledger of promises. To outsiders, they read as eccentric. To me, still balancing the Miami pragmatism with a slowly developing county memory, they were a framework that sometimes prevented worse things. We spoke to neighbors and took statements. An elderly man named Louis Reyes sat on his porch and rocked his knees while he told us about the bell. "Used to ring the bell every Sunday," he said. "Danny Ortiz played it. After the storm, the bell fell and split. We buried the pieces in the yard for a while, didn't know what else to do. People kept coming though, singing. They'd stand at the marsh and sing until the tide took it." I wrote down bell fragments and the year that had lodged in Louis's voice, 1992, Hurricane Andrew. That line threaded through other histories we combed, names like Danny Ortiz and Lisa Fuentes following like stitches. They were not all victims in the same way. Some were young, some old, some had disappeared into the pines, some into the marsh. The number 47 collected around their names like a catalog. In the protocol folder, someone had written once, in a typing that got shaky at the end, 47, do not allow pattern to complete. There was a technical component to this too. Radios behaved oddly near the marsh boundary. We learned that through painful municipal experiments. Handhelds that flashed static right at the line. Dispatches that blurred into the hymn, cell service that retreated into pockets of signal like a tide. If you stood at the cattail's edge, you could hear the county differently, voices like memory. I heard someone call my name when I was empty-handed and alone on the footbridge once, the syllables familiar as my mother's accent. It froze me inside. "Did you answer?" Morrison asked then, in the car with the AC sputtering and 2 thermoses of coffee warming between us. "No," I said, "I didn't." "Good," he said. "We write that one down, Miguel. You didn't speak." The protocol reads like a ledger of denials. Contain, do not engage. Keep the offerings intact. Respect the marsh line. But the ledger is porous where people are hurt. Teresa's brother had been the kind of pastor who loved people in the messy way pastors sometimes do. He showed up at wakes and set a casserole where it wouldn't be noticed. He would sit in a corner and take the story down in case it might become a sermon someday. When death is close to the people who loved him, rules fall out of pockets like change. Teresa did not wait for a meeting. She came to the gate and asked me, with a voice that might have been steel if it were for how the edges of it trembled. If it was you, Miguel, and it was your brother, would you stand and obey a folder? I don't get to make it about me, I said. That's the thing, Teresa. My job is to keep the line. We have to. Keep it? She laughed once, sharp. Keep it for who? For the thing? You think the thing will respect the line? Two things about Teresa. She knows how to make you feel like you're the one with the oversight problem, and she moves so the room refills with her presence. She had names on her tongue like beads. Her father, her sister, neighbors who stood in the rain when his coffin went by. The town had shown up in the small moral ways it knows. Casseroles, flags on porches, the choir singing too slowly. She could not accept that a folder could be the boundary between the people and their dead. "Just 1 minute," she said when Morrison turned away. "Let me through the door. If the candles are there, if the hymn is there, I'll tell no one else." Morrison swallowed. He is the kind of sheriff who knows names and remembers who held which seat in the church decades ago. He measured policy in the air. "Miguel," he said without turning, "what do you think?" I thought about my wife and our kid texting me a picture of supper. About my mother in Miami who still calls me by my childhood nickname when the weather is bad. I thought of being trained to set a border and hold it. I thought of the way the hymn had folded into the rafters, of the candles lit without footprints. Procedure was not a moral curtain so much as it was a thin membrane. Sometimes you gotta peel it back and find that the thing on the other side remembers your name. "Teresa," I said, keeping my voice level, "if you go in, you do it with us there. If you go in alone, you go with whatever answers you bring back. We will document everything. You get one chance, and that's it." Her face broke then, not in a sob, but like a record that skipped. She nodded once, fast. "Okay," she said, "one chance." We opened the door together. The smell of damp wood came out like a breath. The hymn was closer now, a whole chord pressed into the air. The pews had lines of votive stains. The altar cloth had been rumpled and smoothed by careful hands. The candles were exactly where the window made them visible. 13 in their small white geometry. No soot, no melted wax trails. The hymn we couldn't place, a lullaby of syllables that suggested a page somewhere in a hymnal I did not own, rose and fell like someone breathing. "Protocol note," Morrison said, "because sometimes you start to say a thing aloud to keep it from becoming too intimate." He read from the folder in a voice half apology, half habit. "Do not alter the arrangement. If candles are disturbed, record and replace without speaking of names. No photography without command approval. If a voice calls a name, radio and retreat." Teresa moved toward the altar with her hands open like someone offering her body. "Pastor used to say the bell remembers," she whispered. "He said memory keeps people from being lost. We have to remember. We have to—" A sound cut her off, not loud but precise. A bell fragment knocking on stone somewhere behind the altar. It could have been the house settling. It could have been a piece of the old bell rolling in its hidden seam. It could have been nothing we could file under the sheriff's report. Morrison stepped in front of her the way a man might step into a doorway to keep a dog out of a room. "Stop," he said. "Step back, Teresa." She did, and then shrugged off his hand like a coat and set her palm on the wooden altar. Her hand was colder than her cheeks should have predicted. The hymn deepened, and something else threaded into it. A child's voice, or the suggestion of a child's voice, counting softly. 47, it said, and then another voice echoed the number like an answering bell. The walls accepted it and gave it back with a tiny delay, like a heartbeat you feel after the room goes still. I told Morrison what I was hearing. He told dispatch to hold. We were all careful to keep our mouths closed like a bandage. For a running hour, the hymn circled us, and the numbering folded into it. The marsh line outside held its dark, bristling state, the cattails moving as if with their own breath. People were calling from their houses now, neighbors to us and to each other. "Did you hear the hymn? Is it morning? What's going on?" The voice on someone's phone was a static thing, punctuated with the same tune. When Teresa stepped up to the altar again, she closed her eyes. I noticed a photograph peeking from beneath the cloth, an old dog-eared picture of Pastor Alvarez standing beside the bell's rusty rim, Danny Ortiz clapping his hands, Lisa Fuentes grinning with a child balanced on her knee. The photograph smelled faintly like rain. "We can't let grief be wild," Morrison said. "We have to contain it for the town's sake. Rules keep us from acting on the part in us that thinks it can fix everything." "Sometimes fixing is the only thing that keeps me upright," Teresa answered, "and that sentence is the one that split the room for me. Fixing is a hazard. Fixing asks you to do something that rules were supposed to prevent. Fixing makes you trespass over the marsh line because the dead are pressing at the edges of your day and you will not be patient." She placed the photograph on the altar, under the candlelight where the wax pooled like pale water. The hymn rose, and one of the candles guttered as if in a draught that hadn't been there before. No one touched it. The marsh outside answered with a wet, low sound I recognized from storms and from the single time I had tried to drive home across a flooded causeway. A pressure on the air that feels like a hand placed against your chest. Dispatch came alive on the radio then with a new voice. Mrs. Reyes, hysterical on the line. "They're singing at the marsh," she said. "There are people walking into the reeds. They keep saying names. They're walking toward the bell. Miguel, Miguel, I can see them heading in there." I radioed back that we were at the church. Morrison barked orders into a handset like a man trying to pin down a moving thing. We moved to the door in a group, tentative as people who walk into a cellar at night. The hymn rode the glass. "You stay here," Morrison told me. "You see anything, you call." There is a legal and moral difference between staying and intervening. I have been a deputy long enough to know the weight of both. The protocol says contain, document, and only escalate with command approval. It also tacitly concedes that sometimes command will not be around to hold your hand. The porch light across the road blinked once and then was out. Teresa reached out and touched the nearest candle like one might touch a flame to test it. The wax did not blister her skin. She closed her mouth and then opened it like someone reaching for a lost word. "Pastor," she said, voice small, "if you're here, if you can hear me, tell me your favorite hymn." The hymn answered with a phrase that fit none of our hymnals, and then the bell fragment knocked again, the same neat metallic measure. Someone outside the church called my name, soft and intimate. It was a call that belonged to someone who knew me before I put on the uniform. My hand went to the radio without me thinking. Dispatch was blank. The marsh line did not hold a shape, but it held a sound, and that sound held names. Morrison gripped my arm. "We hold the line," he said. "We don't go after voices." I felt the line in my chest like a physical seam. Teresa turned to the open doorway and then walked forward, past the line neither of us could mark on the ground, but which felt like a cord stretched taut across the threshold. Her fingers brushed the flame of the nearest candle, and then she moved beyond it, into the aisle where the hymn washed over her like water. "Teresa, come back," I said, and the words cracked under the pressure of the music. She did not turn. The hymn folded its hands around her. For a moment, everything blurred into a keening silence, and then the child's voice, clear, too young for the adult chorus, counted 47. Someone outside the church began to call names now, and the list ballooned like a rumor. Morrison shoved his radio at me. "Get them out, now!" We moved like a unit of soldiers into a doorway that was not a battlefield. The pews were narrow, the hymn pressing against our ribs like smoke without the burn. Teresa stood at the altar as if she had been waiting all along. Her eyes were wide, pupils swallowing the white. When she finally looked at me, I could see a smear of wet that might have been a tear or condensation from the glass. "Tell me what you hear," I said, because for a second I needed someone else to articulate this. She laughed in a way that was more sound than breath. "They sing the old notes," she said. "They keep the numbers like rosary beads. They don't want rage. They want to be counted right." "Counted how?" I asked. "Together," she said, "not left wandering, not forgotten." Something on the radio screamed, dispatch with a new report. A neighbor calling that someone had walked into the marsh with a flag and was rowing a canoe where there should not have been a tide. Morrison's jaw creased. "We hold the line," he repeated. "Contain." At that, something else happened. The candles flared in a ribbon. It was not a normal fluctuation of air. It was a moment of intent. The wax pool at the altar brightened as though reflecting something overhead. The hymn thinned to a single voice that said, almost conversational, "Miguel." My name felt like a finger on my sternum. It wasn't an insult or a threat. It was an invitation drenched in familiarity. I did not speak. "Don't answer," Morrison mouthed. "Radio, retreat, document." I heard my own voice answer a question I had not consciously framed. "Who are you?" It was an office-scarred thing, the voice of a man who had been trained to de-escalate. The hymn recoiled, and for an instant the church felt like a room waiting to exhale. "We remember," the voice inside the hymn said. "We remember when bells split and when names were swept. We count so we don't drown." I could feel the floor under my boots like a map of faults. Teresa knelt like someone moving to a bedside. She pressed both hands onto the wood and then lifted them as if offering the photograph back into the light. Her lips moved soundlessly, in a prayer I could not parse. Morrison yelled something to the back, "Get the rigs, get the county ambulance on standby," and then took my hand and pulled me toward the door. Outside, the marsh line glimmered like an optical fallacy, the cattails bending to an unseen tide. Voices had clustered at the tree line, neighbors who had taken their station like a vigil. A woman held a casserole dish like an offering and stared at us with eyes that had seen too many funerals. We filed out with Teresa in front, not because she led us, but because she had stepped forward and the hymn had folded around her ankles. The hymn thinned to a single persistent motif, an odd little phrase you could hum without meaning to, and the number 47 lodged itself like a splinter under my thumb. Back in the patrol car, the radio screamed static for 3 full heartbeats and then cut. Dispatch sent a single message, reports of people at the marsh, possible compelled walkers, teams en route. Morrison closed the folder with a decisive snap. "We call in the protocols," he said. "We log everything. We keep people safe." We were keeping things from moving, but you can never perfectly contain the memory that walks. There are times protocol feels like an anesthetic for a town that has to keep living. There are times protocol is the only thing left to hold when heat and grief would otherwise boil a place over. I found myself thinking of the bell fragments, the way Louis had described burying them when there was no place for them, and then how people kept taking pieces up out of the earth like a superstition reborn. That night, the municipal old-timers sat at the diner and spoke in low voices about the only way they could think to stop the pattern. There was talk that would have landed a man in federal paperwork in another life. Burning to remove the anchor. A controlled conflagration to free the town from whatever tethered it. There was talk of the bell fragments, of gathering them into markers. 47 pieces set along the marsh's edge so that counting would be literal and visible, a memorial instead of a refrain. The idea of burning the church sits in the sort of moral fog you wear when you must choose between two wrongs. It is a thing that forces people to fold ethics into ashes and then sweep up the consequences. Morrison said we would not do anything without town approval and legal cover. But the town's grief is a pressure. When it builds, the folder gets wrinkled and read aloud in kitchen lights. Teresa stayed that night at the church driveway, sitting in her truck with the engine off, like a sentinel. I watched her hands clench and unclench. She had done what the protocol forbids, entered the consecrated space, and she had come back with the photograph and a voice that hummed in her head. For that, she was both dangerous and beloved. "Do you think it will end if we burn it?" she asked me when we talked under the street lamp's thin cone. "I don't know," I said, and it was the most honest thing I could offer. "I think it would change the geometry. Maybe it would close the conduit. Maybe the town would be safer. Maybe we'd be wrong." "Wrong about what?" she asked. "Wrong about whether memory needs a place to live that's not tied to a bell and counts." She chewed the inside of her cheek, and I could see the small flecks of ash on her sleeve from the candle where she'd knelt. "I don't want him wandering in the wreaths," she said. "I don't want our dead to become lights. I want to have a place to go. A place with names on stones, not a thing that calls us home." There is a law in small towns that memory eventually becomes ritual. Ritual is how you keep a story from being opportunistic. Ritual protects and ritual excludes. The marshal's instinct is to be neutral about what ritual is chosen so long as the town remains safe. But the line is thin. We planned then, in Washington's diner with bad coffee and the low hum of the evening, what a measured response might look like. We would not rush. We would gather legal counsel. We would bring in county teams, chaplains, and a couple of scientists from the state who owed us favors. We would do the thing that towns do when they are trying to keep a moral ledger balanced. Call in as many observers as possible so the burn is not private. We would call the families, sit them in folding chairs, explain the risk in plain language, and then put the plan to a vote. But plans have a habit of being outrun by grief. News traveled in whispers. Somebody posted a photograph of the candles online, and then someone else called a late-night show. We had more eyes on us than usual. And then, in the low rain the next morning, Teresa texted me a simple line. "I'm going in." I told her not to. I told her the protocol forbids it. I told her we would do the planned approach. She texted back a single emoji that read as a laughing, weeping face. It was the sound people make when they cannot bear two truths at once: that rules exist and that they fail us. By the time I got to the church, she was already inside. The padlock lay on the step like a metal tongue. The candles had been arranged anew in front of the altar, thicker now, more wax, more pooled history. Someone had set a child's wooden toy beneath them. The hymn was louder when you reached the threshold, as if the room had been rehearsing. "Teresa?" I said. No answer. I took 2 steps and felt the air shift like fingers stroking the back of my neck. Her silhouette moved between pews, a dark cutout in the candlelight. "Teresa, we've talked about this." She turned then and smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes. "I couldn't wait," she said. "They were counting." She held up her hand, and I could see the photograph of Pastor Alvarez, damp around the edges. The hymn wrapped us, and the marsh outside sent a sound that threaded like a warning. I tried to reach her, legally and humanly, but she shrank away from me as if my uniform pricked her skin. From the doorway, I radioed Morrison. "She's inside," I said, keeping my voice level. "She won't come out." His voice came back over the static. "Miguel, get her out, now." I stepped forward. The hymn warmed like a stove. The candle's light leapt in the reflection of the altar glass. Then, quick as a breath, the hymn became silence, and a slender sound broke through, a child's voice counting. 47. I don't remember the order of it after that. I remember the smell of hot wax and the sudden fall of air when it seemed a window had been opened into a closet of old weather. I remember a weight behind my ribs, and then the sound of a bell fragment clinking against wood like a small, precise knock. Teresa's hand trembled on the photograph. "Help me," she said, not asking for permission, but making a point. The hymn threaded into her voice and made it sound like company. It was the sound of someone being joined to a chorus at the cost of remembering where they had started. I moved for her then, in a way I had always promised myself I wouldn't. Hands first, because hands are honest. She slipped, and the altar seemed to incline like a slope. Her foot caught, and she went toward the candles. They did not burn her, they did not desecrate her skin. But she slid forward, and her head nearly touched the flame, in a way that looked so like an act of surrender, I almost couldn't bear to watch. "Don't!" I shouted. The word was simple, and it carried the weight of everything we had been trying to do with the protocol. It was also an order that came from a place that knew small-town law and human stubbornness and the thin reed between them. She didn't reply. Her eyes were fixed on something I could not see, some outline of a bell, a memory, a child reciting numbers at the marsh. For a moment she was gone into a sound that was not ours, and then she drew breath and began to count herself, not in a way that made it better, but in a way that made it inevitable. 47, she said, and the room echoed with the number in a way that let the syllables bloom. Morrison shoved through the doorway like a man who had been trained in ways that do not make soft sounds. He wrapped his arms around Teresa and hauled her back. For a heartbeat, we were all suspended. Sheriff, deputy, grieving woman, a hymn, a bell's echo. Then Teresa's shoulders went into a shaking I could read only as sorrow, and the hymn split into something like a groan. "Get her to the car," I said, "because we do what we can when the rest of the world fails to keep its promises." We bundled her and set her in her truck. She held the photograph to her chest like it was a life raft. Outside, the marsh held a stillness that felt like a lid. The hymn thinned into a single long note and then was gone. The candles on the altar remained untouched. The bell fragments knocked once against one another deep in the soil, a tiny percussion under the wood. We did what follows grief. We logged, we took photographs, we wrote statements that would sit in folders with other statements. We called in a chaplain who had a way of folding his hands and letting people tell their stories into his lap. We convened a town meeting where people argued in the way only small towns can, with the language of agriculture and scripture tossed in, with the practical knowledge of who has a truck and who can afford a permit. We tested the radios until the static cut just past the cattails and found that something about the marsh cleans the air of our attempts to speak to it. The suggestion to burn the church took hold overnight like a rumor. Some said ritual fire would drive the thing away. Others said burning would be sacrilege. There was a meeting that lasted until the clock in the diner had run down 3 times. In the back, Louis Reyes said quietly, "We need the bell out, and then we need the counting to be a place." "And if it burns, Miguel?" someone asked me. They were asking the deputy, the man who had to make the pragmatic calls. "If it burns, we document it. We make sure it's controlled. We get papers signed. We get people away. We make sure no one takes it as permission to run wild." My voice sounded small in that room full of hands. Teresa sat with her head against the window of the diner and watched the rain make maps on the glass. She had been quiet since we dragged her out of the church, and her quiet was not the kind that rests. It was the kind that plans. When she finally spoke, it was to ask, "If we make stones, will they stop singing?" "I don't know," I told her again, the honest man acting in measured ways. "But a place with names is for the living as much as for the dead. It gives people somewhere to go." Her face folded then, not from doubt, but from the kind of exhaustion that comes from long vigil. "Promise me something," she said. "If we do this, we do it right. We do the markers. We make it so they can count without wandering." I promised her. It felt like an oath you give in a small town, a thing you have to honor because otherwise the town will fold. That week, the protocol expanded in ink and stamps. We consulted with county lawyers, invited specialists, and convened a small committee of elders who had seen storms that left churches shifted and people displaced. The idea of converting the bell fragments into memorial markers took root because people liked the visible, tactile action. 47 small plaques cut from the old bell, spaced along the marsh boundary, each one bearing a name and a date. The bell, once a thing of sound, would become a thing of place. The candles would remain, arrayed under protective glass at the site of each plaque. The town would count openly and in order, and if the hymn wanted to sing, it would have to sing to a place where a name could be touched. Planning felt like a way to make a wound into a map. But you do not map a wound without touching it, and the act of touching has the chance to reopen. People wanted closure faster than we could legally give it. They wanted to take the law into their hands with trucks and matches and the feeling that sweat and flame could rewrite the past. We had to hold them back. Law and ritual argued in the same room. Meanwhile, the incidents increased. The hymn on radios during the night, a neighbor insisting the figure of a man had come into his yard and walked as if searching for a bell. A teenager left a candle on his own porch and then found it gone in the morning. Small things, strange things. The folder swelled with notes and small diagrams of the marsh line, of where sound bent, of what seemed to attract the counting. The town voted to proceed with a controlled burn, contingent on permits and safety measures, and a plan to preserve artifacts. We would pull the shingles off the steeple where the bell rested and recover any pieces. We would call in an engineer to advise on how to remove the bell fragments without exposing innocent bystanders to risk. We would do it with the town watching under a gray sky, with a county burn permit signed, with lawyers to hold us to paperwork. But before any of the permits were issued, before the shovels scraped the bell's rusty collar free, the marsh gave us another choice. On a morning like any other, the sun a flat coin beyond the oaks, a cruiser chattered across my radio. Compelled Walker moving along Sarras, came the voice, breathless with the kind of fear that makes dispatch lose its sugar. Heading toward the church, female, mid-30s. I felt it then, in the place beneath the sternum where decisions live. The marsh had shifted the pattern. The hymn gathered on the wind like a weather system. We had a choice before the law could finish its forms. Intervene now, risk things that belong to ritual, or follow the folder and hope that containment is enough. We drove like boats toward a storm, lights flashing in a county that answers to a slow call. The cattails swayed like someone counting fingers. Teresa's truck was at the gate with the door open, as if she had intended to wait. The hymn was a thread now, running along the wind, picking out notes that made the hairs on my arms rise. The woman who walked out of the marsh that day wore an old choir robe, thin, threadbare, like something pulled from a photograph. Her eyes were distant with a patient and terrible expectancy. As she stepped onto Sawgrass Road, she hummed the hymn and then spoke a name, and every syllable cracked like an egg. Miguel, she said, and there was no mistaking the way she said it. Not a challenge, not a threat, just the delivery of a longitude we had failed to mark. I met her, and the hymn bent its head like a thing that knows it has been seen. She carried nothing in her hands. Her feet left wet prints on the gravel that dried in the sun. The radio in my pocket hissed and then went perfectly still. Around us the town held its breath. Her lips parted, and she smiled like a woman who had found something she had been looking for in the dark. 47, she said, counting herself into the town's ledger. I reached for my radio and for the protocol folder. I kept my hand from shaking. I was a deputy who had to choose between two necessary industry, the law that demands patience and the human impulse to rescue. Before I decided, she looked right at me and said my name again in a tone that belonged to somebody who had known my mother. And then the hymn turned its head toward the marsh, and somewhere in the cattails a bell fragment knocked once, twice, measured and tiny. The woman closed her eyes as if remembering a body of water, and for a breath the town's age seemed to stand in that space between a bell and a candle. "Victor," I heard someone say from the tree line. A neighbor called out a name, and then another responded with a number. The population of sorrow gathered in a ring, like people waiting for a funeral procession. Morrison pulled me close. "We make a call now," he said. "We call it officially. We decide. We cannot let it choose for us." I looked at the woman and then at Teresa, who stood with the photograph in her hands like a talisman. Memory wanted to choose for us. The marsh asked for counting. The protocol demanded that we do neither rashness nor abandon. My thumb pressed the radio. I had a voice that could call more teams, more county, more legal muscle. I had a duty to keep the line. I weighed the weight of 47 names like coins on a scale. The hymn sighed, and the woman's lips formed the next number. The bell fragments tinked under the earth as if someone were tallying off in another room. I made up my mind in the time it took to exhale. I pressed the radio and said into it, steady and small, "Dispatch, code for containment. Call the county, legal counsel, and the chaplain. Secure the perimeter. No one crosses the marsh line. Not yet." The woman opened her eyes and looked at me, not with reproach, but with that serenity that comes from being counted. She turned slowly and walked back toward the cattails as if she owned the path. The marsh accepted her without a sound. We followed protocol that day because it was what we had sworn to do. We rounded up the neighbors, we parked the trucks in a ring like support beams for a tent, and we called in the county teams with a sense that the town was leaning on us to choose wisdom over despair. By the time the permits came through, the town had already decided that the bell fragments would be removed by a team with expertise and legal authority, and that the burn, if it happened, would be controlled, observed, and approved. We did not know yet whether ritual or law would save us, but we had the feeling then, as the hymn thinned and the marsh's breath fell back into something like a hush, that a fragile negotiation had been reached. Ritual would be acknowledged and reshaped by procedure. The town would remember, and we would make a place for memory that didn't summon the dead back into the reeds. Standing at the marsh's edge that evening, I watched Teresa set down a single candle by the roadside and light it. The flame trembled in the moist air and then steadied like a small, stubborn animal. She pressed the photograph of Pastor Alvarez beside the flame as if introducing them. The hymn was a memory we could now hear as something that belonged to the town and not to an invasive call. "Do you think it will keep someone from being lost?" Teresa asked, her voice low. "I think it will change how we keep ourselves," I said. "It will give names a place, and places help the living remember without losing themselves." She nodded. We did not know if it would be enough. The marsh still breathed, and the bell fragments vibrated beneath the ground like a note waiting to be struck. The number 47 had not vanished. How could it? Instead, it became a ledger we could physically acknowledge. Stones to mark a boundary, plaques for the names, and a system of counting for those who needed to count aloud. That night, when I went home, the hymn threaded through the radio no longer. My wife left a note on the kitchen table with our child's doodles taped to the corner. The photograph of Pastor Alvarez sat in the folder I kept on my desk now, between reports and the protocol. I lay awake and thought of the bell fragments and the way counting can be both salvation and trap. I thought of the woman walking back into the marsh as if she had been allowed to return to something that belonged to her. By morning, the town had agreed to the memorial plan. Bell fragments would be reclaimed carefully, plaques would be cast, and a controlled burn would be the last resort. We would wait for the county engineer and the chaplain and a team with heavy lifting equipment. There would be paperwork, there would be meetings, there would be prayers and arguments and casseroles.
There would be people who thought we were cowards for not acting faster, and people who thought we were reckless to let the town decide. And there would, in the middle of it all, the protocol folder that Morrison kept like a talisman. We revised it to include specific lines about the memorial markers, the handling of bell fragments, and the order of counting. The rules did not make what had happened make sense. They made it survivable. We laid out the plan to families first because grief deserves to be the first audience for decisions about its own. They came with tear-streaked faces and folding chairs. They listened as we offered them the choice of how to mark their lost. Many chose to participate. Teresa insisted on setting one of the plaques herself. When the markers were set along the marsh, each one received a small bronze plate engraved with a name and the year the person was last seen. The bell fragments were incorporated into sculptures that stood like quiet guardians at each marker. 47 markers stood like a low cathedral around the marsh's edge. On the day we dedicated the markers, the town gathered. The hymn played, not from speakers, but from a choir of people who remembered the tunes their grandparents taught them. The air smelled of coffee and wet leaves and the faint metallic scent of the bell fragments. The plaques caught the light like small promises. Families touched the names with fingers that trembled and then steadied. Teresa set her photograph beside the plaque bearing her brother's name and then waited as others did the same. I stood at the back with Morrison and watched how the bell fragments had been repurposed. When the wind passed through the cattails, it made a hollow sound, like a bell being played by a hand that was still learning. The hymn was a memory we had incorporated into place. The marsh line remained a boundary, but not an exile. We had decided as a town to give our dead a place to be counted in public and not to be used as a lever against the living. At the end of the ceremony, as people dispersed with cups of coffee and casserole tins, a small boy ran past me with a paper plane that skittered into the reeds. He chased it laughing and then came back with his shoes muddy and his grin wide. I thought of Miami, of my mother's voice on bad weather nights, of how people make homes out of maps and rituals. Yet the unease never fully leaves. At night, when the wind comes down from the marsh, I still hear the hymn in fragments, one syllable at a time, a memory of a voice that counted and then retreated. I keep the protocol folder in a drawer now, with the new pages inserted, and I read them when I can sleep. They do not make everything safe. They make it governable enough to live alongside. Teresa came to me once after the markers were set and handed me a small bell fragment she had saved, wrapped in tissue. "For the desk," she said, "so you remember we're counting." I have it on the shelf in my office. When I close the door, I can hear it in the quiet, a metallic ping if I tap it, a tiny sound that is also a promise.
It reminds me of the night the hymn named my name, and the night we stood together and chose to count rather than to be lost, to call and wave. We kept the law, and we reshaped a ritual. We did not cure the thing with a single act, and the marsh still breathes at the edge of town in the way it always has. Sometimes, in the pre-dawn, someone reports a candle on a porch, and we go check it and find a woman humming an old refrain. We bring her to the town square or the clinic, and someone sits with her until she remembers herself. We follow protocol, and sometimes protocol bends because we are human and we know how to be compassionate. The folder is no longer just a list of prohibitions. It holds the plan for the markers, the map of the marsh line, the contact list for the chaplain. It is an artifact of the negotiation between law and memory. When someone asks me what the strangest part of being a deputy is, I tell them it is carrying a ledger of people's rituals in your pocket, and knowing that sometimes the most dangerous thing is not the unknown outside, but the memory inside a neighbor's chest. We did not end the hymn. We gave it a place to live where it was less likely to be a lure that pulled people into the reeds. We put names on bronze plates and placed bell fragments like weathered teeth in the marsh grass. We kept counting, but we taught the town new counting, public, visible, shared. That difference, perhaps, is where mercy lives. On my desk, the bell fragment gleams in the lamplight. Sometimes, when the office is empty and the night is a flat sheet, I tap it and listen. The sound is small and true and fits in the hollow space between my ribs. It is enough to remind me that rules are there to keep us from crossing a line we cannot come back from, and that sometimes, when the world becomes uncanny and the hymn calls, we have to decide whether we are going to be governed by fear or by the careful rules of how a town remembers. There is still a part of me that expects to wake one night to the hymn on the wind, a child's counting near the marsh, a name spoken with too much tenderness. I would go to the marsh then, and stand by the plaques and read the names aloud. That, maybe, is how we guard ourselves, by being present enough to count, rather than being absent enough to be drawn into counting without measure. For now, the markers hold, the marsh line breathes, the hymn is quieter. The town learned to keep its rituals and its laws in a kind of careful balance. We are all a little older and a little more watchful. We are all learning that memory can be a place and not merely a voice in the reeds. And on the nights when the wind carries a fragment of the hymn far enough to reach the patrol house, I sit up, tap the bell piece on my desk, and count. 47 names fit in the back of my mouth like a solemn litany.